to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to Talent Optimization. Today we are chatting about diagnosing organizational challenges. One of the biggest organizational challenges that we have seen through the COVID-19 pandemic is mental health and the impact that that has had on different ways inside of our organizations. And with me today is Amee Quiriconi. And Amee is going to chat with us a little bit about how trauma and our leadership has an impact on understanding what is happening specifically with, let's say, employee disengagement. All of a sudden, we see an employee that was our top performer no longer performing well. So, Amee, welcome.
Well, thank you, Tracy. I really appreciate being here. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. So, as we look at kind of organizational challenges that come up, and as leaders, kind of who we have to be inside of organizations, I'm really curious, how does our own, mental health as leaders impact how our organizations perform?
Oh, well, for a while, I think some of us believed that, hey, we can leave all of our personal challenges at the threshold of the door and never let it come into our business. But I think as we mature as adults and also as we see in the world around us, there is no difference. There's no business brain or personal brain. Like, we are holistic human beings. And businesses are relationships. They just happen to be formed around everybody getting paid to do something. And so when we come into, a position where we have the responsibility of caring for people, and really that's what leaders and business organizations have. They have something akin to a parenting role where you have people that come in, they're relying on you for direction, support, guidance. They're in your care, so to speak. Then if we have some unresolved challenges, kind of lurking in the background, in the operating systems of our brain, they can sneak up and surprise us in a lot of different ways in business. We haven't as culturally, there's many of us that are I'm 49 years old. I have to tell everybody that I wasn't raised in a system that taught me about how the brain actually works. And I learned how to know that sugar is bad and vegetables are good as a little kid, but we still haven't gotten to a place where understanding the operating systems in our head is, just as a normal part of our day-to-day life and function as some of the other things that we've learned in time. And so we have leaders, myself included, that have showed up to work and have self-sabotaged, have been aggressive when aggressive wasn't called for, have been too passive, in a variety of different ways. And those end up in very insidious and sometimes direct ways affect the well-being of ourselves as well as our people. And when we affect the well-being of our people, their productivity is a direct reflection of that. And we struggle maybe with getting what we want for our business, either achieving our business objectives or thriving, in a workplace that feels good and healthy that you want to go to every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this sometimes goes back to what are our core values, and are we connecting specifically to what those core values are? Because when we are, we tend to bring things forward. So for example, one of our core values is fun, right? Another thing that we are very specific about is that we are self-aware and we have ways to kind of say, hey, tap on the shoulder. Do you realize that this impacts that way? Oh my gosh, I had no idea, right? And so when we can bring those core values into what our business is, we're much more likely to look at this and go, oh, we can actually talk about these things. Because when we don't talk about them, they become those silent killers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, and there's a thing that some people, however, even being able to communicate vulnerable topics, right? Like an emotion, somebody gets angry or someone's upset or they're feeling demotivated. There are a lot of people in this world, it's unfortunate and it's okay. I always have to say this, it's okay that having those types of conversations don't feel safe. They don't feel psychologically safe to sit there and go, wow, let's think about this from like a more compassionate human perspective. And I think that that becomes a challenge in business because leaders have, often felt like they need to be the stoic, brave face. And again, this very dominant parent role in their organizations. And, and if you had parents, honestly, that didn't want to talk about feelings or told you to toughen up or whatever, we bring that into the culture of our business and how we end up working with our employees. And when you say like, listen, I actually would like to be able to let you know that this is upsetting for me, or listen, I'm really struggling here and I might need some more time, or can we take a break because I'm becoming overwhelmed, by, what's happening in here. There are people that genuinely that triggers their own traumas and their own fears, and they respond negatively to that. And that's, to me, that's just as unfortunate and sad, and also just kind of needs to be considered in leadership. That I appreciate that you and I have come to that place where we can talk it all out, but there's a lot of people that never learned how to even do that. And so it feels really scary to think about bringing that awareness to business and to do it. And so it's easier to just default to the way that they've been doing it, which is to not do it and just, manage.
Right. And that not doing it and managing then becomes a part of the culture. So for all of our listeners, I want to ask a question. I really want you to think about it. What is the culture of your organization when it specifically relates to communication? And what do you want that culture to be? Because as we start to talk about, the diagnosing organizational challenges, sometimes those challenges are brought in from the outside. What we as humans, and Amee, you said this at the very beginning, and that was at home comes into work and vice versa. So if you're going through things at home, that's going to come into work. It can't stay separate. I think about like the analogy that I use is I was told all the time, Tracy, you need to have like an imaginary tree that every time you walk home from work, you put stuff on that tree and you leave it there so you never take anything home and vice versa. And I'm like, it doesn't work that way.
Wouldn't that be great if it did? And it doesn't, right? Like it definitely doesn't. However, people believe that it should because someone's told them it's supposed to. And so then when we can't do it, that's just another way in which we find ourselves feeling ashamed or guilty or frustrated with our inability to be able to draw these hard lines between work and home. And, we got to say here, like, what trauma informed is, you don't have to draw the line. Because it's impossible to do. And so stop beating yourself up if what's happening at work is bleeding out at home and vice versa. You're a human being. You're doing the best that you can. That's honestly, given the circumstances, depending on what it is, that would be expected. But we don't know how to give each other that grace and that understanding and compassion, to let us all be humans 24 hours a day,
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm super curious. What is a trauma-informed organization?
Well, trauma-informed means, first of all, being aware of how prevalent trauma actually is out there. There's a couple of ways that they've been able to measure it. And one of the more, most famous versions of this was a study done in 1998 by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And it was the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And they had basically taken 17,000 people that were in the Kaiser Permanente insurance plan down in the San Diego area. And they created a questionnaire of 10 questions, and they were addressing what they would call, again, an ACE, an adverse childhood experience, experiencing divorce, abuse, neglect, witnessing abuse, several other questions in there. And they wanted to see the relationship between adversity in early childhood from 0 to 18 years old with a long-term outcomes in health and illnesses and wellness. And what they found was that over 2/3 of the people in the study actually experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. And about 20% of the participants actually experienced 4 or more. And when you looked at the number of ACEs that a person had and you related it to their long-term health or physical health conditions, there's an astonishing correlation between the more adversity that you experienced and witnessed and had happened to you in your first 18 years of life, the worse your health outcomes were, by large numbers. And so that gave us this idea of well, how prevalent is trauma then in our culture? Well, we're looking at the fact that most of us have experienced at least something, and that, there are a number of us, a substantial number of us that have experienced a lot, growing up. And that ACEs study didn't include specifically the effects of trauma due to racism or experiencing trauma due to medical conditions and disabilities. And so it still wasn't even the best list that we could come up with. I mean, they've added on it, they've corresponded to it. So a trauma-informed organization first says it's there. Trauma is at work, whether we talk about it or not, it's showing up every day in some form or another. It either happens in the fact that our employees are coming in and they have some things in their past that have contributed to their responses to their world today as adults, or the trauma could be happening right now in the moment. Either like a pandemic, let's say, that ends up doing a universal worldwide trauma, on everybody, experiencing the racial movements of last summer and watching and, vicariously being traumatized by watching the death of Black Americans on video and on TV being played over and over again. Those are traumatic experiences. And so then a trauma-informed organization says, we know that it's there. So what can we do with our policies, our practices, and our management and our leadership styles to make sure that we're not re-traumatizing people that have this in their background or doing things to trigger and traumatize people right now? And when you do that as an organization, then what you're doing is you're allowing and creating this greater sense of psychological safety, and you don't have people that are on guard all the time or demotivated or angry, hostile, depressed, anxious, whatever it is. And so that's like the bigger kind of generic impression of it. It is in a way of recognizing again that we're holistic people and that we have a whole life, and not to measure us based on just a business metric, like this person is not performing at their job. It's to ask not what's wrong with this person, but what's going on with this person. And so if we're dealing with challenges like communication problems, or we're dealing with conflict issues or anything like that, instead of calling this person as a toxic employee, which is a term that we see and hear a lot in business, we're actually starting to reframe our perspective of, is there something that's happening that we need to be aware of? Is this person experiencing trauma at home? Is the manager of this person actually hostile and abusive, and it could be re-triggering their own history of abuse that we should be aware of? And how can we change and adapt ourselves so that we can do that? And so, it is resisting re-traumatizing, recognizing that it's out there, and realizing that there are things that the organization can do to create a healthier place for everybody.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of draw a line here. This doesn't mean that as leaders or HR professionals, we need to be psychologists inside of our organizations, right?
Right.
I want to be really careful that we're separating out what those are. And then we're also saying, hey, there's a whole myriad of things that we need to look at, right? Like, hey, do we have the right person in the right role? Are we aligning with how they need to be led? All those things are there, right? But what we're really talking about is, hey, there's times when someone comes in where we know that there's things happening. We don't want to re-traumatize that. Or we've got a really great employee that maybe all of a sudden started not to be. Or we've got a not great employee that, hey, if we shift them, they all of a sudden can start to do things really, really well. It's being aware of an and both, right? And I want to throw that disclaimer out there because what I hear so often from my HR listeners is, man, Tracy, this sounds really heavy and I'm never going to get anywhere with it. So I just want to be careful of that, to say, hey, there's small bites here that sometimes just that awareness allows us to do 10,000 things forward. So I'm going to share one of my own stories here because I think that it's one of those that was really a wake-up call for me as both a leader and how a leader really showed up as a leader to me. So I was in an HR director position inside of an organization. And inside that organization, I had a specific situation happen. And I'll back up just a second to say we had just implemented an employee assistance program, shorthand for HR, EAP, right? So our EAP program was just implemented. And Amee, how often are EAP programs actually used?
I rarely see them used. Most of the employees don't even know that they exist. They're kind of like, hey, we have an EAP, and then that's it. They're not referred to, they're not recommended. They're just like it's there, and then it's like a one and done.
Right. And we could have a whole conversation about how EAP programs could really support individuals and leaders when we specifically talk about how do we become this trauma-informed organization and how do we do that, right? That's a different podcast. Mm-hmm. However, so we have this EAP program, we just implemented it. So I had a situation happen where my boys were little. They were, I think, 4 and 6. And we were coming in the front door. It was like 8 o'clock at night one night. And this gentleman came up behind me, pulls a gun to my head and takes my purse, right? So I come into work next day and I'm pretty flustered. And my executive director at the time sits me down and she's like, Tracy, why don't you go to EAP? I looked at her, I go, I'm not going to EAP. She's like, why? And I'm like, well, the stigma involved with EAP. I'm a leader. I don't need EAP. I'm not going to go to EAP. I have to tell you that those 3 or 5 sessions were so transformative of, hey, how do we work through this? And the light bulb for me was, none of us are above this, right? We are all human, as you've been saying this entire conversation. And we also know that we're all experiencing these things. And her leadership, to say, why don't you go to this? I'm like, I didn't think I could, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a culture thing that we're creating. And as the HR director, I'm thinking I can't go to EAP is ridiculous. But how many of us are out there listening to this going, So these beliefs that we have, I really think that we need to challenge, because if we're not looking at ourselves first and challenging what our own beliefs are, we can't take our organization there either.
Right. And that's why, my focus is usually, it's not going to be as successful if like the HR department comes up and says, listen, we know we're dealing with a lack of trauma sensitivity in our organization. We have managers that manage, by bullies. We have some passive aggressive employees. We have like toxic communication. We need to be trauma informed. That won't go as far if the leaders themselves, even above and beyond, actually don't embrace that culture. Because one of the most important things about a trauma-informed organization is the establishment of trust, of trustworthiness. Because if we've had traumas like you experienced, there is a sense of, you lose your trust if you've experienced trauma. It makes it harder to be able to form a bond or a connection with somebody else because, you've experienced the withering and the removal of that trust, pretty regularly. And so if leaders won't embrace it and aren't willing to go through some of the hard work, it's vulnerable work, like you've mentioned, Brene Brown, we're talking about the fact that leadership today is about transparency and vulnerability. And when we can't get to that place and we just want to kind of farm out to somebody else in the organization, it's not going to sink its teeth in and really step in there, because you might have some layers of trauma-informed practices and awareness in there, and that's better than none. So don't hear me say that don't do it at all. Mm-hmm. But one leader who comes into a room, lays into everybody, tears somebody down in front of everybody, and then leaves again, will erode all of that trust building, and all of that psychological safety in a heartbeat. And so, I commend your leader, really making sure that, they helped you feel comfortable with doing that and taking that step there, because again, there's a lot of great resources out there for us to address. And to your point about HR people, like I get HR people, like no one's asking anybody to suddenly become a psychologist in the organization. That is not it at all. It is just having this human to human awareness, So somebody's coming in with a problem and we've got some miscommunication going on, misunderstandings, a trauma-informed perspective is that when we're under stress, we all show up a little differently to the table. Some people become more aggressive. And those are the ones we tend to identify as the toxic people, like, they're a bully or they're aggressive. We don't recognize it as they're stressed about something. And so what they probably need is they probably just need different skills on how to be able to manage the stress and how to recognize that when they're under stress, that they become aggressive, and give them some tools to be able to learn and communicate differently, not penalize them or label them as a bad person, And the same can go true. And what I love about PI, and we talked about this, is we also tend to focus as organizations on the more aggressive people, right? Squeaky wheel gets the grease. And we tend to disregard, I call it, the quiet people in the organizations. Some people actually become more passive and people pleasing and withdrawn when they're under stress, but yet they don't get as much attention in our organizations, but they're likely to leave us too. And they're under a lot of strain. And HR leaders, recognizing that, again, we show our trauma or our triggers in different ways, and it's on both ends of the spectrum, fight or flight. And so, that's just kind of like, having that awareness of like, oh, yeah, I'm upset right now. And I guess other people would get upset about something else too. And I should, just be aware of what that looks like for different people.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had such a deep conversation and covered a lot of different areas with this. And so, we always kind of like to land our plane here with what's one key actionable takeaway for executives listening in.
When we talked about this ahead of time, I think that the biggest actionable item is, I said, notice the influence that you have. And like your leader was one of those. But my big thing that I always communicate with leaders, the first thing that we can do is start to notice when we're actually triggered at work. because we probably get teed up a lot more often than we realize. And our natural system, because we're human beings, is once the trigger goes off is to actually go fight or flight, depending on whatever our system actually is. And it is to take the next step on autopilot. Now, unfortunately, our triggers are based on our past experiences. So it isn't our ability to predict the future. It is a recollection of something that happened to us in the past. So our triggers may not be the appropriate response at that time. And so when leaders start to realize how often they're actually being triggered, start to get curious about what's going on. Again, you don't need to go to therapy at that moment to figure it all out or know the whys behind it. But then you start to realize how much we can fluctuate during the day. And then you go, wow, if I'm going up and down like this during the day, and I can imagine that my other people are doing that too. And so I always tell people, like, notice your body at work. When you're seeing an email that sets you off, and we've all had that, right? Misunderstandings start, our brain starts to get all twisted up and stuff. Your triggers will be an indication of how much, work is pushing you and causing you these upward, these up and down emotional fluctuations. And once you start to see that, it's just like anything. Once you notice that you have a trigger, you can totally change your awareness of it and perspective and the influence it actually have on what you end up doing next.
And you can ask for support or CEP, because guess what? We're not robots.
We're not robots.
So what's one actionable takeaway for our HR professionals listening in today?
Aside from, like I said, recommending taking a look at that, I do actually have a quick assessment. I could recommend that, and I'm happy to supply to you, Tracy, that you can pass along. And it allows you to just kind of do an inventory of your programs. There are 6 pillars of a trauma-informed organization, 6 areas of your business that you could look at. One of it is do you have a safe environment, where people feel emotionally and physically safe? What is your organization's trustworthiness and transparency, about operational decisions and things like that? Do you have a very closed organization? Do you have peer support and mutual support like EAP programs or, resources for employees? Do you have an environment that fosters collaboration? Do your employees have empowerment or voice or choice? Can they actually raise concerns? And have you taken a look at some of the cultural, historical, racial, and even gender issues that are abound in there? And do you have any areas of the business that maybe, aren't as fluid and, still have some of the biases built into it? And if you were to sit there and think about again, I didn't mention anything about did any of you get psychology degrees and, become therapists. We're looking at what aspects of our company actually do create a stable, safe environment for employees so that they can be most productive, thriving, working well together with each other, which then ultimately allows our businesses to be able to hit their goals, hit their strategies, and do what the business was created to do.
Thank you so much. And I love your 6 pillars. And so if you're listening into this going, oh my gosh, I need more of this. So we will have the link to that survey in the show notes. So check out the show notes. That will be there. And if you're a part of you will be on with us on Monday. So when this airs on Thursday, the following Monday, we will be doing a webinar specifically digging into these 6 pillars. If you catch this later on, just note that we do record these so you can still gain access to that. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And if you're looking for more of Amee and some specific information about how to find her, we have her website linked in the show note along with LinkedIn and, of course, this assessment that we just talked about. So thank you so much for joining us and digging into this challenging, I say challenging, right, in air quotes topic. But it's one of those conversations that we all need to have and be really comfortable having it because we're all human. And we need to be able to ensure that, those emotions as they show up in those triggers are somewhat normalized in a way that we can talk about them so that we can optimize our performance and really be fulfilled in the work that we're doing each day. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.